Thank you very much, Jane, for that very generous introduction. As you know, when you get such a generous introduction, after that it's all downhill. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here. Noor Latif and the Foreign Policy Association have been old and dear friends of mine, and many of you, I remember from the days that I was here as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, so I'm really glad to be back here tonight. I know the number one thought on your minds is the blizzard that's coming. And you're probably trying to figure out how you're going to escape it, and I have to escape it early tomorrow morning too, when I leave town. But since you are preoccupied with the blizzard that may be coming, I thought that I should begin by giving you a blizzard of good news that is coming our way. Because frankly, one of the biggest points that I try to make in this book that you see over there, The Great Convergence, is that the human condition has probably never been as good as it is today, especially if you take a macro view of the world as a whole. In several dimensions, we have made some remarkable improvements, especially in the last 20 or 30 years. And in fact, we may have experienced more positive developments in the last 20 years than the past 300 years. And it's actually quite striking how few people have noticed this. Because, you know, you wake up, you hear all the bad news, you hear about Syria falling apart, you hear about attacks in Mali, and you get the sense the world is falling apart. Actually, it's the exact opposite that is happening in the world. So let me just give you 2 or 3 examples of how dramatically the world has improved. First, I mean, the one thing, of course, there's been a defining aspect of the human condition is that we have been fighting wars for 2,000 years or more. And yet today, the prospects of an interstate war, especially a major interstate war, is the lowest it has ever been since we have kept records of this. And the number of people dying in interstate wars is also the lowest there has been since we have kept the records. As recently as 1950, 1960, about 500,000 people would die a year in interstate wars. Now it's less than 30,000. But this is also part of a larger change in the human condition, whereby violence is also diminishing. Now you won't believe this if you wake up and read the newspapers every day. But you know, there's a wonderful book that was brought up by a Harvard professor, Steven Pinker, called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And if you read it carefully, and if you read the data he provides, clearly something has changed, and we actually are fighting and killing each other much less than we've ever done so. And I actually can say this with some degree of personal conviction, because, you know, unlike many of you, I grew up in a region of the world in Southeast Asia which was known as the Balkans of Asia. In the 50s and 60s, no one saw hope for that region, and there were conflicts going on everywhere. There was the Vietnam War, there were communist parties fighting, and the whole region was a region of, you know, hopelessness and despair. And quite remarkably, this region of hopelessness and despair, with 600 million people, is now become almost as peaceful as the European Union. The prospect, we don't really enjoy the benefit that the European Union has of zero prospect of war, but that's the direction we're marching in decade after decade over the past few decades. And so, if in a troubled region like Southeast Asia, you're moving towards eventually reaching zero prospect of war, that's a powerful indication that the world has changed fundamentally. And it's something that we should take note of, and I'll explain later why we should take note of. Then, of course, in the area of the people at the very bottom of human society, as you know, we've been trying to eradicate poverty for decades and decades. And all along, we thought, well, we'll do the best we can, but this problem cannot be solved. But guess what? You know, when in the year 2000, when I was here as the ambassador to the UN, we established something that were called Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, certain targets that we hope we could meet in 2015 to improve the human condition. And most of them, actually, we will not meet them because they were ambitious targets. But guess what? The one target that we will actually meet is the halving of global poverty by 2015. In fact, the latest data shows that we will overshoot the target and achieve more than what the MDG set out to do. And even more remarkably, the National Intelligence Council of the United States of America, which I'm sure you agree is a relatively conservative body and will be very careful about making projections, has predicted that global poverty will be eliminated by 2030. That's quite amazing. Global poverty will be eliminated. It's something that we thought would never happen. And it's going to happen. But this is again part of another larger change where you're seeing for the first time billions of people around the world who, for a long time never thought that the condition would be improving are now beginning to join the middle classes. And just to give you, I don't want to drown you with statistics because, I'm sure you, at some point in time, you'll say, well, I'm not going to remember all the statistics. I'll just mention a few because you can always go back and Google and get the data anytime you want. But the figure from Asia is absolutely stunning. Today, in all of Asia, there are roughly about 500 million people with middle-class living standards. That's a reasonable sum, 500 million people. But in 2020, which by the way is only 7 years from now, in 2020, that number is going to increase from 500 million to 1.75 billion. An increase of 3.5 times in 7 years. That's an increase of 1.25 billion. The total population of the West is roughly 800 to 850 million. So, we are adding almost 1.5 times the total population of the West into the middle class world. Now, if that's not a blizzard of good news, what else do you want? And if you extrapolate it, by the way, globally, as by 2030, more than half the world's population will be in middle class. That, again, is a dramatic improvement in the human condition. So, remarkable things are happening, and we're not taking note of it. And that's why I thought, I have to write this book to tell everyone that good things are happening. Of course, the reasons why they're happening are very complex, and I discuss some of them in the book. But one of them, a good way of summarizing it, was an argument that Steven Pinker put forward in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he said that humanity is basically climbing up what he calls the escalator of reason. As we educate more people around the world, as they begin to be aware of what's happening, and they say, okay, I now understand how it is possible to achieve peace and prosperity for my country and for my society. And that information is spreading throughout the world. And as a result of that spread of information, as a result of education, all these remarkable things are happening. And of course, by the way, I should emphasize, technology helps. As you know, nowadays we can have almost immediate access to information of virtually anything in the world. And in the past you couldn't get it, but now you can. And this is also, by the way, and this I must emphasize, happening also in the poorer societies. Now, the first step towards connectivity, as you know, is a simple thing like a cell phone, right? Now, in 1990, which is only 22 years ago, in all of India, there were 0 cell phones. In 1990. Today, there's 750 million. From 0 to 750 million in 2 decades. In China, they had about 18,000, and now they have close to 900 million cell phones. And with these cell phones, and again, people are now improving their lives. I saw a statistic recently. I was at an ADB meeting in Manila, and one Indian executive was mentioning that 2 years ago, India had something like 5 million smartphones. 1 year later, they went from 5 million to 50 million smartphones. Now, with a smartphone, as you know, you can download, say, Wikipedia. And on Wikipedia, you can get any information you need. When I grew up as a child in Singapore, all I dreamt about was to buy the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I could never afford it, and I never bought it. But today, even if you're relatively poor, all you need is a relatively simple kind of a $50 tablet, which is now again growing in numbers, or a simple smartphone. You get Wikipedia, you get all the information you need in the world. So it's a different world, and it's a better world that we are creating. But at the same time, I also think that we should not take all this for granted. We should try and build on the good things that we have achieved and try to secure this momentum that we are having clearly towards a better world. And I do think that there are some very easy things we can do. But to do those easy things, we first have to understand how, in a sense, with all these changes, the nature of our world order has changed. Now, describing a change in a world order, of course, is a complex exercise. You can give several hours of lectures on it. But I use a very simple analogy to capture the essence of that change. And this analogy is quite simply this. I say that before the contemporary era of modern and rapid globalization, when 7 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was like living in 193 separate boats. And each boat had a captain or crew to take care of the boat, and there were rules to make sure that the boats didn't collide with each other. And that was more or less a description of what I call the 1945 rules-based order. Now, I say that as a result of globalization, as a result of the world having shrunk, the 7 billion people in the world no longer live in 193 separate boats. The 7 billion people of the world live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat, but they have captains and crews taking care of each cabin, but no captain or crew taking care of the boat as a whole. And this analogy actually explains why we seem to be facing global problem after global problem. Because while we are busy taking care of our cabins, these global challenges are affecting the boat as a whole. The most dramatic one that we saw recently, obviously, was the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. I'm sure those of you who lived in New York remember the days of terror after Lehman Brothers collapse. And everyone thought, gosh, the global economy is going to go off a cliff. And it could have, by the way. I mean, the sense of fear was so profound that even a president like George W. Bush, who, as you know, has a reputation of being a relatively unilateral president, paradoxically became the first American president to convene a meeting of the G20 leaders in 2008, November 2008. This was followed by the April 2009 meeting of the G20 leaders in London. And as you know, that meeting pulled the global economy back from the cliff. And what actually happened at that meeting was that the leaders of the world came out of their cabins, went up to the bridge of the boat and say, our boat is sinking and we have to coordinate and we have to save the global boat. And they did it. But the tragedy is that having taken care of the crisis, once the crisis was over, they went back to their cabins. And that's why all the subsequent G20 leaders meetings have failed. And it's a tragedy because it demonstrated very clearly that it takes a crisis for people to understand that we are on a global boat and we have to work together. And in a financial crisis, it's pretty obvious, so you can react right away and therefore maybe come together. But you know, we have other kinds of crises which may demonstrate that we have the intelligence of a frog. You know, as you know, they say that, you know, I don't know whether it's true, but anyway, the story is used all the time, that if you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, he jumps out right away. But if you throw him into a pot and you slowly boil it, he enjoys the warmth and stays in and dies. Now humanity actually is going to be doing exactly the same with global warming. Because it's happening very slowly, we're going to allow ourselves to be slowly boiled, and then we may die. Because it's not an immediate crisis, we won't react and handle it. And that's going to be a big challenge for us. Because, I mean, one of the things I emphasize, I know there are skeptics about climate change, and we do not know whether the skeptics may be right, but it doesn't even matter, because as long as there's a possibility of global warming happening, and I'm sure those of you in New York who experienced Hurricane Sandy have got a whiff of what might come. Surely it's in our interest to come together and take care of these challenges before they overwhelm us. And that's why I think we have to recognize that in this new change global order, we have to collaborate and coordinate with each other and work together. And you might think that this is going to be very difficult. So let me, for my final part of my remarks, conclude with some good news also. That actually, it may be very easy to improve the global order. Now, why do I say this? I say this because, you know, if you really want to, in a sense, have a better governed world, now don't dream of a world government, because a world government will not happen. It certainly will not happen in our lifetime. World government is out of the question. So, but while global government is out of question, improved global governance is a possibility. And we actually do have, fortunately, in place for a long time, many institutions of global governance, whether it's the United Nations, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so you already have in place these institutions. Now I'm going to reveal a big secret to all of you. One of the best kept dirty secrets of the world is that it has been Western policy to keep these institutions as weak as possible, and especially, sadly, American policy. And this American policy was a result of a conviction that for a superpower like the United States of America, institutions of global governance will only constrain you, and so it is in American interest to weaken them. But now, actually, I do emphasize in the book that it is time for America to revisit that assumption. Now, I know that I do not have the persuasive capacity to influence the American public opinion, which is why I begin the book by quoting from a speech that Bill Clinton gave in 2003 at Yale University. And this is what Bill Clinton said, in essence, in that speech. He said, if America assumes that it'll be number one forever, then fine. America should carry on doing whatever it is doing and not feel any kind of restraint in any way. Then he added, if we can conceive of the possibility that America might be number two someday, surely it's in America's interest to create a global order which will then constrain the next number one. That's very sensible advice. Unfortunately, it was not heeded. That's why I thought we have to build on his wisdom and explain why this is necessary. And it may happen, America may become number two sooner than most people anticipate. When I first started writing about the rise of Asia, and I've been writing about the rise of Asia for 20 years now, I think, I anticipated that, the Chinese economy may become as big as the American economy, maybe in 2050, maybe in 2040, maybe in 2030. But Jeff Sachs of Columbia University wrote a letter to the Financial Times last year, providing some very simple statistics from the IMF in PPP terms. In PPP terms, the United States share of the global GNP was 25% in 1980, while that of China was 2.2%. Now, he said 2016, but now IMF has amended it to 2017. In 2017, which is 3 to 4 years from now, the United States share is going to go down from 25% to 17.6%, and China's share is going up from 2.2% to 18.2%. So in PPP terms, America will be number two in 3 to 4 years, and in nominal terms, maybe another 5 or 10 years after that. So clearly the world is changing, and so it is now in American interest, in Western interest, to create a global order where you have stronger rather than weaker institutions of global governance. So one simple thing that each and every one of you could do is to go back home and write a letter to your congressman or senator and say, isn't it time that we revisit our policy of keeping these institutions weak? And so, but there are of course concrete ways in which these institutions are kept weak. And this is why I think I gave a few suggestions on what can be done to reverse the policy. The first way in which not just the United Nations here, but the United Nations and all the other specialized agencies have been kept weak is through what's called zero budget growth. So even though the global economy has grown, and even though the global society that the United Nations serves has grown, its budget has been shrunk. And that obviously keeps the institution weak. What's even more damaging, by the way, is that even specialized agencies like the World Health Organization and the IAEA, which are very important, have been kept weak. I mean, frankly, as you know, if next time a global pandemic breaks out, right? Pandemics don't carry passports. They don't queue up at immigration to say, can I come in? They walk right in. And to deal with that, you need a global agency that has the authority and the legitimacy to investigate all these diseases. And only the World Health Organization has that. As recently as 20 years ago, 75% of the WHO budget came from what's called assessed contributions, which means compulsory contributions, and therefore you can have long-term planning on the basis of compulsory contributions, and 25% was voluntary contributions, which can change year by year. Today you have the exact reverse, where only 25% of the WHO budget comes from assessed compulsory contributions, and 75% comes from voluntary contributions. And that's madness. It's madness because you can't recruit health inspectors, doctors, PhDs, researchers on the basis of voluntary contributions for long-term careers in the WHO. And the same way you can't do that with the IAEA either. So clearly the time has come to stop starving all these institutions and now provide them with the resources to make them stronger. And that's a fairly easy thing that we can do. And by the way, in global terms, the amount of money that you need to revitalize these organizations is very little. You know, the budget of this UN Secretariat that you know is on 42nd Street and First Avenue, it spends, I think, less than the New York City Fire Department. Surely, an organization that is designed to take care of the world deserves a little bit more money than the New York City Fire Department. So that's an example of how you need to change our mindsets. Similarly, I think we need to reform some of the organizations like the UN Security Council, and I also have suggested a new formula for reforming the UN Security Council in the book. But finally, probably the most important thing we need to do is that if we come to recognize that we are all in the same boat today in the world, all 7 billion people of us on the same boat, then the time has come to develop what has been called a new global ethic, and understanding that we are all living together in one small world, and we therefore have to come together to work to keep this world together. Now, this will require a significant change in mindsets because, as you know, our global order rests on the concept of what's called national sovereignty. And most governments are designed to protect their national sovereignty. So conceptually, governments are designed to take care of cabins on the boat and not take care of the boat as a whole. So we have to eradicate this conceptual structure that we have planted in our minds. And this conceptual structure, by the way, comes from the Westphalian Treaty, I think, of 1648. That's over 350 years old now. And yet, we retain 17th century conceptual structures to handle a world that is now rapidly entering the 21st century. So, when do we get rid of that conceptual structure? So we do need to begin rethinking what needs to be done. I think it can be done. And as I said at the beginning, even without a plan in hand, we have created a much better world already. Just imagine how much more we could do if we would come together and agree on a plan. Thank you very much.